Welcome once more, ladies and gentlemen, to the Castle of Madness, that is the Adventures in Historyland YouTube channel. Wherever you are in the world and whatever time it is you're watching this, we have a new All Things Wellington video for you, joined as usual by the Tower Keeper and Swordsmith Marcus Cribb, and a new guest, Mr. Zack White, who runs basically the last forum standing about the Napoleonic Wars. But you can introduce yourself to the audience, Zack.
Hi everyone, I'm Zack, PhD student at Southampton University. As Josh has kindly said, I run the Napoleonicwars.net forum, which is the successor to the Napoleon Series forum, which ran for, I think it was 2 decades, and was the world's great online hub. And I also run the podcast The Napoleonicist, amongst other things.
Right, so tonight we are talking, we're sort of picking up where Marcus and I left off last, but in a different way. We're not going to continue with the campaign precisely, but we are going to talk about lots of very nerdy things, which we all love, which is the armies, as of the evening of the 16th of June, 1815. And that means, of course, not limiting ourselves to the 16th of June. We can draw on references before and after if necessary. But that is the topic tonight. Who's first?
Marcus, do you want to kick off?
Brief overview. So it's interesting to note that it's not his Peninsular Army. Quite a lot of the regiments were sent overseas. There's still the badly named War of 1812 is still ongoing, and there's still quite a lot of regiments that Wellington, if he didn't actually write that he wanted them, which he did for some, would have physically wanted. So those men are really essential, and Wellington does point out to a visiting member of Parliament, a British soldier, who's looking at a statue in one of the Brussels parks, and he says, "That article there is what I depend upon." And he's talking about having British soldiers that are trained through the British system. These are supplemented, of course, with the ones with less experience, and a whole host of allies, which we really must not downplay. They're really important to the Waterloo picture. It's the same case for lots of Wellington's generals. So we've got Delancey as his quartermaster general, whereas Murray, who is his in that position in the Peninsula, is back out in the War of 1812. So it's a real mixed match of fresh troops who've come in, the allies, which I say we're going to go into some detail, that make up this Anglo-Allied army, and the veterans themselves, which actually make up the minority really there.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm really glad that you raised that point about how this is an Allied army and not a British army, as people so often try to describe it, because it's not Britain versus France at Waterloo. It is a European-wide force that fights Waterloo and the whole of the Waterloo campaign. We must downplay the Prussian element either. The British contingent made up exactly a third of the force under Wellington's command. That's before you factor in the Prussians. The Dutch Belgian was about 30%, and then from other German states we're looking at about 25% Hanoverian, about 8% King's German Legion. But even within that British contingent, as you say, there aren't as many Peninsular War veteran battalions as Wellington would like. He asked the British government for 40,000 men, which was never going to happen, realistically. The British government couldn't get together that number of troops to send out in time for the campaign, although they did try particularly hard. And I was reading Rory Muir's biography of Wellington quite recently, going through some stuff on Waterloo again, and he makes the point that actually that request for 40,000 might really have just been to motivate Horse Guards to strain every single sinew to try and send out as much as he possibly could. And what's quite telling about the way that Wellington divided up his force is that not only does he not quite trust the Dutch-Belgian contingent in the sense that they haven't been tried, and until very recently they had been allied to France, and had been trained in the French system. And a lot of them were actually wearing uniforms that were quite similar to the French uniforms, and that certainly put some soldiers on edge. But when it came to his veteran units, his Peninsular War battalions, he was very, very careful about where he put them. There was only one regiment that had been out in the Peninsula that was put in the Prince of Orange's corps, and obviously the Prince of Orange was appointed for political reasons anyway. But it says quite a lot, I think, that he didn't dare leave one of his best regiments, or most of his best regiments, to the Prince of Orange's corps. You see a brigade of essentially Peninsular War units under General Adam. That's in Clinton's 2nd Division, which is in Hill's 2nd Corps. But the vast majority of them are in his reserve corps. So Wellington kept the reserve corps under his personal command. And almost all of the big names from the Peninsular War, things like the 1st 95th, the 1st 42nd, the 1st 92nd, the 1st 40th, were all kept in that reserve. And most of them were kept in a single division under Picton's command, which again says a huge amount about who Wellington trusted. Picton was, for those who aren't familiar, quite a controversial figure, quite a kind of bullish individual. He had been tried for cruelty during the period when he was governor out in the West Indies for having sanctioned the torture of a female inhabitant out there, but was later acquitted, which was why he was able to have a rank as a divisional commander.
Picton was by this point suffering pretty much with post-traumatic stress as well from his time.
Yeah, I mean, a few commanders on both sides are thought to have struggled. PTSD is possibly something we want to talk about a little bit later in terms of the rank and file as well. But Ney is thought by some to have had PTSD, although that's never been confirmed. Interestingly, Napoleon doesn't seem to have been. A guy called Ed Koss, who wrote a brilliant book, All for the King's Shilling, did a study. He got a group of psychologists from the US Army to examine lots of different quotes about Napoleon's mental state, about his actions at the time, and they concluded that there was no sign of PTSD from the available evidence. Plenty of evidence of narcissism, but that's not particularly surprising. So yeah, Picton, very controversial. A number of the divisional commanders that Wellington had with him at Waterloo were significant names that had acquired a reputation for being competent during the Peninsular War. So Colville, Cole, Clinton, Alton as well, all individuals who had played some kind of role out there and had acquitted themselves well, because Wellington was a man who put his trust in people who could do a good job more than anything else.
Absolutely. It's interesting that you bring up the officers who were there. And what we should say is that because of the way the British Army worked, I can think of a couple of battalions who did not serve in the Peninsula, who nevertheless by this point had officers in them that had, for instance, famously the Scots Greys, who had not seen active service since, I believe, the Low Countries campaign in the 1790s. By this point, they had most of their squadrons were commanded by officers who had served with other cavalry regiments and in some cases infantry regiments in Spain. This doesn't include their commanding officer, who did not do that, but many of his troop commanders and squadron officers, troop officers commanding squadrons, did. And I think that's probably what we're looking at in those British battalions that did not serve precisely in Spain, because after the war in Spain, officers who could moved up ranks. They were trying to obviously reduce the size of the army at that point, but it did. Holes were made that needed to be filled. Officers exchanged out, retiring from half pay and things like that, onto half pay, I should say. Sorry, and that obviously meant that while untested, you have an element of experience, leadership-wise at least, in them. Also, we should point out, a little like the Scots Greys, you have that thing, and this ties into why Wellington said, I depend on that article there, because the British Army system at the time placed a great deal of emphasis not only on drill and training but on regimental memory. And I'm going to use the example of the 5th Division at Quatre Bras to explain this. That in the last great French cavalry attack of the day, led by the Comte de Valmy, General Kellerman, the 5th Division was attacked by a decent and successful, recently successful body of cuirassiers. And Sir Thomas, standing in one of the squares, I believe it was that of the 28th, he bellowed out, "28th, remember Egypt." Now, the 28th, the 40th, and the 42nd, I believe the 44th as well, had all been in the Egyptian campaign. Someone can correct me if I'm wrong there, but I think that's correct. Very few of the rank and file would have, though, by that point, remembered Egypt. But they had it on their colours, and in many instances they wore it on some regimental emblem. And so they knew precisely, because of the Sphinx flying above them, that the regiment had stood in Egypt, and therefore they would stand too. And that's why Wellington placed such a great emphasis, even on his untried battalions, because he knew how they worked.
It's certainly a factor that still plays a part today. We've mentioned before in previous episodes things like the Scots Greys, now the Royal Scots Dragoon Guards, have the eagle from Waterloo on their cap badge, and it's their regimental day. But there would be subsequent sub-regiments and sub-units, that use the battles that have like a Salamanca squadron or a Talavera company. And that still plays a part, so that those men will have learned that bit of history. If I can just take a moment, because we've bandied around quite a lot of terms about corps, division, army. If I can just very quickly just break it down to anyone who's in layman's terms. A British regiment at the time could be a couple of different battalions, but typically most regiments were deploying one battalion of men. There was sometimes two, and a few had more, like the 95th had all three battalions there. A battalion of men is the main unit that the British Army uses in the regimental system. At the time, it was composed, in theory, of 10 companies of 100 men. But this was very hard to ever fill up, and the smallest regiment and battalion at Waterloo was about 450, and the largest being actually over 1,000. So it does fluctuate, but in theory, it's meant to be 10 blocks of 10, so 1,000. They're put into brigades, which can be anywhere between actually 2 to 4, typically in a brigade, so 4 battalions in a brigade, give or take 1 or 2. It really does vary. There's quite a lot of fluctuation, but that's a typical one. Then again, those brigades, so you've got regiment, company, make up the regiment, make up the brigade, they become a division, and then various numbers in the division make up a corps, and then those corps make up the individual army. So company, battalion, brigade, division, corps, and the cavalry is very similar. They just use the term troop or squadron. 2 troops typically make up a squadron, make up the regiment, make up the brigade, and then it's very similar again. Just there's a lot of terms being bandied around. So they actually, the different names denominate the size of the greater units that are going around.
Absolutely, and it's worth just going back to what you were saying earlier, Josh, about the references to the regimental colours. What you're saying there taps into an ongoing debate about what motivates a soldier, both on and off the battlefield, and what is it that accounts for unit cohesion within a campaign and in the heat of battle. And there are a few schools of thought. In fact, 2 of the significant books relating to those are behind me, Andrew Bamford's Sickness, Suffering and the Sword, and Ed Koss's All for the King's Shilling. And they all centre around discussion of a theory that was put forward by Stephen Westbrook a few years ago, about what he called a 3-legged stool. He identified 3 main areas that accounted for troop motivation. The first was coercion, which kind of does what it says on the tin. The second was remuneration, so that's through payment, plunder, whatever it might be, getting something back. And the third was what he called normative, and it's within that normative element where the debate really exists. Ed Koss places a lot of emphasis on what's known as primary group theory, which was something that was first discovered by army psychologists interviewing troops coming off the front line in the Normandy campaign in 1944. And what they found is that what really kept a soldier going was his mates within his mess, the person who had to fight. He had to fight with on a day-to-day basis and therefore lived with. And they identified that for a lot of people, it was that bond of trust, knowing that come what may, you had people around you who would fight and die for you because they trusted that you in turn would fight and die for them. And so Ed places a lot of emphasis on that. Andrew Bamford is inclined to put a lot more emphasis on the regimental system, which goes back to what you were saying, Josh, about that notion of loyalty to the regiment. But interestingly, I mean, Ed does acknowledge the significance of the regiment, because it is quite clear that that sense of honour, that you had to defend your king's colour and also your regimental colour. And if you lost either of those, it was a huge stain on the honour of the regiment, and therefore that reflected on you personally. So Ed acknowledges the significance of both. But it's that tends to be debated a fair bit. Some also try and throw the loyalty to the nation into the mix, or identification with a political system. It's worth bearing in mind that this model is meant to apply across time, so it's meant to apply to armies today. And for a lot of historians, even looking at something like the Second World War, there's debate about whether within the German Wehrmacht people were really politically motivated. Certainly when you talk about Wellington's army, it's very hard to identify any form of political motivation. The rank and file were not politically educated. They were increasingly educated to an extent, although by no means universally literate. But this idea that they somehow identified with defending the political system back home in the UK is just completely fanciful.
Well, slightly different. They didn't get a say in its running, so it would be very hard to engage with it. I think you're right. They're saying that the motivation of patriotism might help in the recruitment, but standing on the battlefield, it literally is shoulder to shoulder with the man next to them for all the line regiments. So that's going to have a huge deal of trust.
Mm-hmm. I think I remember reading somewhere, I forget stupidly because I have that sort of brain. I remember somewhere reading on this subject of the troops at Waterloo, and I think it was a soldier who fought at Waterloo who said, which was to the effect that he was never afraid that his regiment would run away. I think he said something like, the others may run away, but ours would not. This was a present mindset across the British Army, that I can't save the rest of them, but we'll be all right because I know the chaps.
That's it. There's a really good account in the accounts of Rifleman Harris, which says he's a private soldier in the Peninsula, and he says that they're firing in line, which is relatively unusual for riflemen, and the guy in front of him, the French are coming on, he turns to run, and they all push him back into position, but they never trust him again. They just go, oh, we're the 95th, we don't run away, what are you doing? And the next regiment are going to be going, oh, well, we're the 68th, we don't run away. And they're just going to keep that kind of mentality, which works for the greater army's cohesion.
Mm-hmm. And that's precisely how primary group theory works. It is that sense that if you do something that isn't considered acceptable within the behavioural norms and expectations of that group, you will be kicked out, you will be shunned. And Ed makes the point that actually that could pose really significant risks for your survival, because a lot of what people don't realise is that the army was starving for a lot of the Peninsular War when it came to rations. Even the nutrition that they were meant to get wouldn't have covered the tasks they were required to fulfil, just purely on calorie burn alone. But then the fact that they weren't actually even receiving rations had a huge impact in itself. And so one of the ways that they offset that was to put food into a communal mess pot, but also they would plunder. And so if you then went and effectively grassed up your mate who had gone and stolen 3 chickens from the farmhouse and shared that plunder, then you weren't going to receive your cut and you needed to eat. So it really did have play a significant impact.
Yeah, absolutely.
What was the discipline? You were talking about the Peninsula, but I know you're doing quite a lot of research on this. What was the discipline like in Wellington's army in June 1815?
I think when it comes to Wellington's army at Waterloo, there isn't a lot of time for a clear trend to emerge in terms of what was happening from a discipline standpoint. What is quite clear out in the peninsula is that it's not quite as simple as this kind of vicious system based purely on flogging. Don't get me wrong, a huge amount of flogging goes on. I've looked at something like 9,500 cases between 1808 and 1818, which isn't all of them by a long shot. It covers everything within the top 2 tiers of court, but about a quarter of what's in the bottom tier, the regimental court martial. And across that period, from what I've looked at, I've got a count of 2 million lashes, which is an eye-watering number. The maximum theoretical punishment for the most serious offences is 1,500, although that's never actually handed out. But things like 1,000, 1,200 weren't unusual in terms of punishments. So discipline could be very harsh and very vicious. At the same time, you have got a push for reform that's coming particularly from the top down. So the king, as far back as 1807, turned around and said that actually a 1,500 lash punishment wasn't necessary. And in his opinion, 1,000 lashes was quite enough. Now, 1,000 lashes could still kill you. Let's not
1,000 is still a lot.
his order. It is. But it wasn't a direct order. It was a suggestion, and so therefore there were cases where courts turned around and said 1,200 lashes. You can stand there and take it. But the system is more subtle than just this case of this is military law and you will obey it, and if you don't, there will be consequences. And it comes back to this sense of discretion and the need to maintain morale. And a lot of what my research looks at is the stuff that gets swept under the carpet, or those instances that get ignored. For those who've read memoirs, both during the Waterloo campaign and during the Peninsula, it's very clear that officers were very willing to turn a blind eye to plunder for subsistence, where people were stealing food in order to survive. To take Waterloo as a specific example, you've got George Simmons actually actively sending men after the Battle of Quatre Bras to deserted farmhouses in search of food to plunder. And he makes this comment, look, civilians have left their houses, but don't be long about it, saying, we need food for the officers, go get it for us, but don't be long and don't be dumb enough, is what's really being kind of coded into his message. Don't be dumb enough to get caught.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
exactly.
It's interesting that you say that there wasn't time for a character of discipline to emerge in Wellington's army in Belgium, just because of the time frame you're talking about and its size and composition, essentially. And as you were saying before, he didn't know a lot of the officers. He didn't really know the army, and that was his big problem with it. It took him a good half of the Peninsular War to get used to the Peninsular Army and to get it to work like one of his hands, essentially. And he had just didn't. And the one in 1815 didn't work that way. I've read, and on touching on discipline, you don't get a lot of. There's no famous that I can think of instances of harsh punishments in Belgium, because for a long time it wasn't considered the theatre of war. It was the jumping off point. So
it's a friendly nation, so
yeah. There was, going back to the second Dragoons Scots Greys, a couple of what you might call administration issues of discipline, which I think were probably quite typical of army daily life, which one of their NCOs, there are a surprising amount of good letters and accounts of the Scots Greys, and one of them is brilliant because it's just so ordinary. He's in charge of packing up the tents, and it's found later, after some confusion going on the way to Denderhooten, which is down near Ghent, I think, that some of them are missing. And this causes an almighty fracas, because he arrives later that night to find out that he has essentially been put under arrest and charged with the loss of government property, and a court-martial ensues, in which he is cleared because nobody can actually find out who lost the tents. But it was found that he was not negligent, and I think that is the sort of level of disciplinary action as a regimental courts-martial typically you're going to see in Wellington's army, the British side of Wellington's army anyway. in 1815 prior to the commencement of the actions.
And what's very telling about that specific example, because I remember reading through that account that you mentioned, is that he talks about being arrested, but actually he wasn't concerned. And the reason that he wasn't concerned, and he admits this in his account, is that he knew that he had done his job properly, but he also had the trust in the system that it would be based upon evidence and not hearsay for him to be able to therefore prove his innocence. And that, I think that speaks volumes about how this system, for all that it is based significantly on flogging, albeit that there is this live and live attitude in other areas, when it comes to trial, the rank and file know that they're only tried when there's a case to answer, and that if they can prove that they haven't done anything wrong, they will be acquitted. It's not a sort of kangaroo court system, which some people have tried to sort of characterize it as. There is a genuine system of evidence, and I wouldn't quite say a fair trial, because I think the fact that a lot of these men aren't particularly eloquent, they aren't particularly literate, you can see it playing its part. There are examples of people being on trial, and they try and be clever, particularly when it comes to desertion trials. They try and be clever with the people, especially if they're civilians, who've had a role to play in their arrest, and they turn around and say, oh, but wasn't it the case that this, that and the other? And they frame that question quite awkwardly, and the civilian turns around with an uncompromising answer, and it all falls apart. So defences often aren't particularly eloquent and particularly successful, but when you are able to prove your innocence, the system allows for you to do that. I think that says a lot about how the system does actually work quite well when it needs to.
Agreed. I think we should, in my mind, I don't know how, I think it would be nice to mention the artillery before maybe we get on to the international contingents.
Oh, I should mention God's Own Gunners, yes?
Yeah, the first thing that comes to my mind is that I don't think Wellington had had this many guns since Victoria.
I think 157 guns off the top of my head, plus the rocket troop.
Depends how you want to count it. Some will tell you it's 200, somewhere in that region. But yes, more guns than he's used to, certainly.
Mm-hmm. And actually, the Royal Artillery and Royal Horse Artillery are brigades in the case of the foot artillery, and troops in the case of the horse artillery are commanded by quite experienced men. Unlike the rest of the army, probably the gunners represent a great deal of experienced veterans. You even have cases in Royal Artillery and Horse Artillery diaries and journals and things of him directly addressing officers by name, which he only did to people he knew very well from Spain and Portugal. I think it was Ramsay, who he didn't have the best relationship with due to the debacle at Fuentes de Oñoro, or however you pronounce that he actually did call out to him as he rode past at Waterloo. And certainly, I don't know what anybody else thinks about that. Would you say that the artillery represented slightly more experienced?
It's interesting that you raised the artillery, because, of course, the one person who Wellington really wanted to command the artillery was Alexander Dixon, who had done such a good job throughout the Peninsular War, had risen through the officer ranks because of his ability to do exactly what Wellington needed him to do when it came to the handling of the artillery. And I think Wellington probably felt the absence of Dixon quite keenly. But there is controversy with the role of the artillery at Waterloo, and I'm very sorry to raise this, Marcus, bearing in mind that you are an artillery man.
If you're going to talk about counter-battery fire, I was going to mention myself.
Well, no, I'll leave counter-battery fire to you, although that is worth mentioning. It's the controversy about the cavalry charge, the French cavalry charge, and the artillery supposed to have been pulling back into the squares, and in reality what they do is they pull right back. And Wellington said in a private comment, I think it's worth saying, which means that he didn't necessarily want that to be public knowledge, although anything that Wellington said, whether it was private or public, ended up being public knowledge. He talked about how he was quite hacked off with the fact that the artillery pulled right back, didn't pull into the squares, they pulled right back. And he felt that may have put him at a disadvantage when it came to trying to fend off the Imperial Guard. Although I think it's worth saying that although some certainly did pull back, they did they appear to have restopped and then returned to the fight in some cases.
Yeah, I think that's true. Not to interrupt Marcus here, I'll just add before you go, Marcus, that because I was reading certain bits from Cyborne's letters from the Royal Horse Artillery, and Bull, who wrote his account on the 25th or the 29th of June for Augustus Fraser, talked of that actual instance. Bull's commanded the howitzer troop, as it was termed, and he talked of maintaining his position above Hougoumont, pretty much, until basically he ran out of or was running low on ammunition and coming under fire, and then he pulled right back alongside his left flank battery, which also did the same thing, I think. And they restocked, and then they went forward. And he was unlucky, according to his account, because as he went forward, the first massive French cavalry attack came up, which prevented him from occupying his ground, taking his ground, as they put it. And it was a while before he could regain that position. So, whereas on the other hand, you have, I think, Webber Smith's troop, Royal Horse Artillery, reported that his men did leave their guns and ran into the squares. So you have a rather patchy occurrence across the line, I think, certainly in the British artillery, of necessity and inclination of the commanding officer. Certainly some troops and brigades had to replenish ammunition, whereas some, like Mercer, famously, for instance, did not trust the troops in his rear. And other ones doubtless just thought, it is the rule, I must remove my guns.
It's quite a difficult one with the gunners, then, so that's a nice point to link onto. Because in theory, they were meant to take the horses to the rear when they were threatened, and the gunners who were left were basically meant to just run and either dive into the squares or actually lie down underneath the front rank, who'd be kneeling, holding their muskets with bayonets like a pike. And it's quite difficult because we're talking about regimental honour. That in the Royal Artillery, you don't have flags, they're colours. Your guns are your colours. And they're given real reverence. Not only are they an item of war, but they are an item to be honoured and upheld with dignity. For example, it's still tradition today that when the colours are a gun, so that can be like a self-propelled gun, it looks like a tank to a layman's term, is driving across a parade square or on parade, it is saluted. It is given that honour. So it must be quite difficult that not only is it their main tool, they are gunners who are there going to shoot at the enemy, it is their honour that they've been told to either abandon it or move it to the rear at the opportune moment. So that didn't happen. It would have kind of a defence, but trying to justify it. But the other one I was going to say, the gunners came up really badly out of the whole Waterloo thing campaign, because Wellington didn't give them much praise, and one of the reasons was counter battery fire, I believe, as well as not abandoning their guns at the right moment. Wellington had his 150 to 200 guns, let's say the most he'd almost ever had, and plus his rockets. And he said, but we're always going to be outnumbered, so don't start this huge artillery duel, because what's going to happen effectively when you open fire is if you start shooting at their guns, they're going to just all concentrate on you. And people like Mercer, he admits that he was seeing a French gun. He goes, brilliant, they're gunners, we're gunners, let's open fire on them, ignoring the orders that I know has come from the Duke. They start doing that, and they start taking huge, heavy incoming fire and attracting attention. It's like jumping up and down, waving a high-vis jacket in the middle of the battlefield. And,
they do.
Yeah, and so he kind of, I think he writes in his diary that he basically regrets that moment deeply as these huge incoming weight of leads head towards him. So the gunners, as much as I have real bias, don't cover themselves in glory as a whole from the battle.
I'm going to bring up Bull again here, just because he's fresh in my mind, partly. But it's interesting because that got me thinking about, I read something in there that got me thinking about Mercer's unfortunate decision as well, and Wellington's order. It's very clear that across the line at certain points, every gun battery pretty much took a shot at an opposing battery if it came in range, every now and then. And Bull...
They wanted to, didn't they?
Yeah. And I believe Bull wrote that he came under fire from a French battery, which he said was very well saved, came up to, it must have been on the left or right of Hougoumont. And it started to play on his position, and it wounded some men and was in danger of hitting horses. And so he detailed his right or left section, I forget which one, which is 2 guns, to engage it. And they pretty much forced it off. So obviously they were excellent gunners. But these are probably the instances that to keep in mind as well when thinking of the artillery and the counter-battery fire thing, which is once the battle really got going, the French gunners were going to be less effective at really targeting down, massing firepower on particular points. So you could react as necessity demanded. So some people might be a little overly harsh on the artillery for conducting counter-battery fire, because I think it would be unavoidable in some cases.
I don't think he understood it as well as some of his other branches. Wellington actually basically ordered that the rocket troop, they'd gone on from their experimental stage when they'd gone out to Leipzig, but he ordered them to give their rockets off and man guns. And I think they took that order on and then basically protested that they are the rocket troop, and were given both then guns and rockets to man. And they used rockets quite a few times, even during the retreat between Quatre Bras and Waterloo. So it's good they had them. But it's something that obviously it shows that Wellington doesn't understand all of these branches in depth. And he's very much, Wellington's got flaws. He says something that is going to be the rule of law effectively within his army.
Mm. Well, he certainly never cites his own guns. He's never that specific, and for a very specific man, he never does care particularly much about where the batteries are placed, so long as they are doing their job.
He does cite regiments occasionally.
Yes.
He does
so
them in.
That might be telling. But we should talk about the Cavalry Corps now, which is commanded by the Earl of Uxbridge, and it's a large and well-appointed body of men. So that means basically good horses, well-equipped. But again, it's another matter of controversy, isn't it, the cavalry at Waterloo? As if Wellington's cavalry doesn't have enough controversy about it in itself.
Yeah, it's worth mentioning for people who perhaps aren't familiar about the controversy between Uxbridge and Wellington as well. In the Uxbridge ran off with Wellington's brother's wife during the Peninsula.
Well,
and
he didn't really want Uxbridge as his second in command initially, but he had Prince Regent's kind of patronage. I just want to say they actually it's a brilliant story that he ran off with his kind of sister-in-law, but they actually do become closer friends. And as you both know, his Uxbridge's portrait, later Anglesey's name, sits next to the Lawrence of the Duke of Wellington in Apsley House, and in the Waterloo banquets, he's only like 3 seats down, just next to the other side of the king. So gets the seat of honour as well. So they kind of have this really strained relationship, which later kind of reconciles, which is quite a kind of it comes off nice in the end almost.
Yes, they have a very they're seen walking arm in arm around the Great Exhibition in later life and things like that. But I wanted to raise about the Earl of Uxbridge at the controversy of the commands, which is excellent that you brought that up, because I was going to overlook it completely, Zach. There might be a bit too much read into it, but he did the elopement and therefore did not serve in Spain. Paget, of course, when he was Paget, he did command Sir John Moore's rear guard with great skill, and was thought of as the finest cavalryman in the British Army, especially when Le Marchant got killed. But Wellington worked with Sir Stapleton Cotton, who had served in India, and he was another man he trusted. He knew how he worked, he knew how his mind worked, he knew how to act around him, essentially, and that was always the important thing for Wellington.
That works with Wellington. He likes to know his men. He likes to get a quick answer. I was reading earlier in preparation for this that one of his new staff officers that hadn't been with him in the Peninsula didn't know the way he worked, and he asked what's down that road, and the staff officer starts to fumble for a map, and Wellington goes, "Oh, you old fool," and one of the other officers say, just say somewhere. If it's wrong, correct it later. And I think later on he goes, how many rounds of ammunition does this gun battery have? And someone goes, 420, your grace. And they go, I'm not quite sure really, but I'll give him the right answer later. I quite like that for Wellington's character. It's better to have an answer now than a true answer.
That's obviously a blessing and a curse in some cases, and maybe that accounts for the problem at Les Essarts. But someone just told them they have enough ammunition. But back to Uxbridge, the other thing about him is, the reason he didn't serve in Spain was that he was, at a certain point, he was too high ranked to serve under Wellington in Spain. So it was just a simple thing that he could have, because he was asked a couple of times, I think, and he himself said, I can't, because that would put Wellington in a position that is just undesirable for a commander-in-chief. So I think Uxbridge's appointment, or the controversy about his appointment may be less personal than it is practical.
Well, Wellington never complained about it, did he?
Not really, no.
Which says something in itself.
I think he had a few jokes at Uxbridge's expense, but that's probably just his humour.
Wellington had jokes at quite a few people's expense, didn't he?
Well, it was a huge controversial thing, Uxbridge running off with his brother's wife at the time with an 1800s hat on. It was a huge scandal because their divorce courts had to were really quite public, and the names had to be presented in Parliament, publicly read. He definitely didn't want Uxbridge initially around him, and then
at the time, I'm sure he wouldn't have been at all possible back in Spain, Portugal, when he returned to Spain. It would have been impossible, really, socially, and just for him to probably have worked with him. But as time went on, it became more just simply that Uxbridge was a lieutenant general at some point. Paget was lieutenant general at some point, and that meant having two high senior officers, possibly with seniority. Did he have seniority on Wellington?
Initially, I think he would have done, yes.
So that would have been impossible to do in Spain, actually.
But then technically, Beresford did, by virtue of having a marshalsea in the Portuguese army.
Yes, that's the Portuguese army, so that doesn't quite count.
Therefore, inherently, inferior to the British army? But
yes,
no, I know what you're saying.
Yes. Absolutely. As far as horse guards are concerned, that does not count. Uxbridge, moving on to Uxbridge and his command, he had a very large, as we were saying, well-equipped, well-found corps of cavalry, which he felt very happy with, I think, although he did admit to Wellington that he wasn't quite sure of it, because in the months up to it, he spent a lot of time trying to organize it, as Wellington did with the entire army. And I think he complained a few times about how difficult it was to organize it, but in terms of the men and the regiments, he was fairly happy with it, I think.
Well, and again, the problem he would have had is similar to the artillery, is it was huge compared to the Peninsula. Wellington was always saying that he never had enough cavalry. I mean, he was always saying he didn't have enough of pretty much everything, but the cavalry he was normally pretty short of in Spain and Portugal. And at Waterloo, it wasn't absolutely huge, but it was pretty sizable. I believe bigger than anything he had. And then you've also got you've got the Dutch and the Hanoverian contingents, as well as the King's German Legion regiments that are there. So there's a sizable number of cavalry in the corps.
And the quality would have been much better because the horses would have been fresh. They weren't, or certainly fewer of them would have been sourced from the local region, which was a problem in Spain, trying to find remounts for exhausted or dead horses. So in terms of quality, the troops were fresh, the horses were of better quality. Most of them would have been English or Irish horses, which were considered better than the local Spanish horses. So there was a lot of reason to be encouraged by the cavalry that he had with him at Waterloo. Although the reality is that their discipline when they faced Erlon wasn't quite what he needed.
Indeed, and that ties into the whole main controversy of the British cavalry in the Napoleonic Wars, doesn't it? Is the discipline.
Galloping at everything.
Galloping at everything. Now, in terms of Waterloo, the 17th of June was fine. They did well on the 17th of June, excellently. And Uxbridge is the man you want in a rear guard, and he only had cause to complain of one regiment which did not charge when he asked it to, just outside of Genappe, and he had to call on the Life Guards to do it instead, I think. One of the light dragoon regiments refused to charge or something like that, or didn't hear him, or were confused by the order. Didn't charge with enough celerity. But on 17th of June, they did very well, masking the retreat. And on the 18th of June, there was a lot of work for cavalry, but a lot of casualties as well. And a lot of that is put down to the lack of discipline amongst the two heavy brigades that counterattacked the French First Corps.
I'm going to say proportionally, the two heavy brigades, especially the Union Brigade and then the Household Brigade, they take, I think, somewhere between like 46 to 50% casualties. Whereas the light cavalry, principally light dragoons, there's I think a couple of hussar regiments in there as well, but they take a lot less casualties because they don't have that huge overstretch, Ponsonby's charge, which they kind of kind of decimates the heavy cavalry brigade so much. So that kind of factors in on the leadership beneath Uxbridge of the cavalry is always called into question. This kind of, I think there's a lot there. The men that are going for the glorious cavalry charge and making a name for themselves, which is kind of the stereotype of the cavalry, rather than the strict discipline that they should have.
It's interesting, isn't it? Because it comes, there's probably a lot to unpack with the cavalry, discussing why it acted the way it did. Because, for instance, the French said that it was because they didn't have enough officers in the rear of the squadrons. Therefore, all the men required to command were usually way out in front. The other thing is, the curious thing as well is that certainly at brigade level, you had a lot of experienced officers who had served in Spain. So it's a complicated subject when it comes down to the fact that often it's just the truth that the British cavalry never had sensible reserve, as Uxbridge was later to bemoan, that he placed himself in the front of the charge, that some colonels like Hamilton of the Greys is cited on several occasions as actively ordering his men to charge on without reforming, and it's like I say, it's complicated and difficult to actually find one answer.
It is. Ian Fletcher wrote a book called Galloping at Everything, didn't he? And I think his conclusion was that the comment is unduly harsh, but there is a commonality when you think about Talavera on a smaller scale. Some units of cavalry overextend themselves. I think it's to the north of Wellington's position. I think they get caught out by a ravine or something, don't they?
Yeah.
It happens to an extent at Salamanca. Initially, that charge led by Le Marchand is incredibly effective. Really helps to roll up the French left and decimates two divisions in effect. But then keeps going, keeps pushing on, having taken apart two divisions, obviously in fairly poor order by that point. Even if they were able to form cohesive units, those units would have been mixed up. And you see it again at Waterloo, an incredibly successful charge. Very hard to know whether or not it was timed to be as perfect as it was, because from the French side, it seems that, going by the accounts, that they were just at a point of disorder, having crossed a fairly thick hedge, and they were trying to reform, and they get swamped on multiple sides. It's an incredibly successful charge, but then they just, I don't know if it's bloodlust or quite what it is, but they overextended themselves.
They did. the credit for the charge lies completely, I think, with Uxbridge.
Do you think the timing is deliberate, or do you think it's chance?
As far as I'm aware, this is again going mostly from my research into the Scots Greys and the men who had left accounts of that. From the passage of events that they describe, which is a lot of officers coming and going, Uxbridge deserves the most credit. I think he did roughly time it, because the way they moved was as D'Erlon was coming up, at a particular point when they were engaged on the crest of the ridge, his cavalry, the heavy cavalry, were already moving forwards. So that suggests an anticipation that they would need to charge, and from then on, I think it becomes down to the brigadiers, brigade commanders. So Ponsonby's aide-de-camp, I think it was de Lacy Evans, who later served in the Crimean War, is possibly the man who ordered the Union brigades to charge, because I think Ponsonby was riding a horse which threw him, because it was a new horse, and Evans had to wave his hat in the air to order the charge. So I think there was deliberation. I think the cavalry officers, as I was saying, the senior cavalry officers were good, experienced soldiers. They knew the timing that cavalry needed. So I think they saw the opportunity and they saw the danger. And I think it worked out, obviously, incredibly well. But
until a point,
in the valley, nobody called rally, and there were no reserves. The light cavalry were essentially the reserve, but they were off on the left somewhere, and they came down and saved the situation, or remnants. But as it was often the lament, there was no firm reserve, and I believe Uxbridge never forgave himself for not having commanded the reserve personally. We can say that the cavalry were engaged for the entire day, and the light cavalry don't get enough credit for the many charges they made repulsing the French cavalry from the squares. But there is less controversy about that. I suppose that can bring us to the international element of the army. And I think it would be right to start with the King's German Legion and Hanoverian contingent, who are the closest to the British regular King's troops, I should say, because actually the Hanoverians are also the King's troops. And obviously the King's German Legion are the, I don't know, what is it, the Foreign Legion of the Hanoverian army, in a way.
They're very much part of the British Army. There's quite a few regiments of artillery, cavalry, and infantry, and light battalions as well at Waterloo. And they've been integrated well within the British brigades and divisions, because they've got a lot of experience. They've nearly always seen active service, because you're not going to raise a foreign corps effectively and then pay for the extra upkeep of foreign troops to then have them lingering mostly down on the south coast of England and the Isle of Wight. I think the cavalry over at Weymouth and the infantry over at Bexhill kind of way in England. And they've seen a lot of service. They've got a good reputation for discipline as well. They've got a very good reputation for discipline, both internally and also within the battlefield. So they hold good esteem, but also they're given places like Le Haye-Saint to defend, which is a critical point in the middle of the line, and really the battle is kind of pivotal upon that central axis. So I think opinion is always high of the King's German Legion, and rightly so.
It is. I mean, they have a great reputation, but at the same time, they're not what they were when they were formed, were they? Because their ranks had been thinned so much in the Peninsular War. They could no longer recruit from Hanover specifically, which had been the plan after Napoleon occupied it, which therefore meant that they had to fill the gaps in the ranks with deserters from the French army out in the peninsula, really with any foreign nationals that they could find, so that quality, that core, really began to be watered down. They certainly weren't Hanoverian any longer. But they had a reputation for steadfastness. Certainly, it's very, very rare for you to find comments from British soldiers criticising the KGL in any form, in a way that they weren't inclined to be so generous with Spanish, Portuguese, Dutch, Belgian troops. So I think that says something about the trust. And as you say, La Haye-Saint, a significant position. There's lots of debate about how significant, but if nothing else, La Haye-Saint had to be occupied because you couldn't allow the French to occupy it, as was proven later in the day. So yeah, really significant. But it's worth also factoring the Dutch Belgians and the fact that they were trusted, because people forget that there was a Dutch Belgian contingent that was deployed at Hougoumont. Yes, the Guards famously held the chateau, but also a significant Dutch Belgian contingent were there too.
I think I was reading some of Gav Glover's work last week, and they were saying that at the lowest point the Guards had around 200 men, and they were probably outnumbered 3-1 by Nassau Dutch Belgians. To go on to roll that back to the Dutch Belgian wider before the battle, then the makeup of the artillery and cavalry and the infantry of the Dutch and Belgian troops.
Yes, obviously this is the Prince of Orange's own men. They're on their own soil. I think there's a little bit of acrimony between the Belgians and the Dutch, because the Belgians don't really like the Dutch. But
they've been an independent nation or autonomous region of France until quite recently.
But they're good troops. There's no doubt about it. I think people mistake national prejudice for and mistrust of the unknown in an army, especially a 19th century army where communications is so very different, with some sort of sneer. I mean, of course, the British thought they were better. That's a national prejudice. But it's not exactly as if, say, the Dutch Belgians didn't just resent that because they felt they were just as good. And there's a lot of talk about the divisions within the army. But people shouldn't fall for that simple and fairly inconsequential, and in the grander scheme of things, the prejudices of the time, because they were good soldiers. Many of the officers had fought for Napoleon, it must be said, with distinction. I believe Van Merlen of the Dutch Belgian cavalry was a good, Van
Merlen, because he'd fought for Napoleon until quite recently, until the fall of Paris, I believe, till 1814. So.
And wasn't it Chassé? He was another veteran, and I believe he also had distinguished service. So you're dealing with another. It's not like the British particularly, I think. It's not that they have inexperienced troops, although there's a lot of militia. In their line regiments, I think they're fairly dependable troops. It's just, again, Wellington did not know this. He'd never fought with them before. He didn't know many of them. He only knew the Prince of Orange and Constant Rebecque, basically. And he had trouble politically with them as well.
There's also a noticeable tendency, and I would argue that it's kind of an example of xenophobia and partly a demonstration of an emerging British national identity, if that's not anachronistic to speak of it at that time, because it's still very, very embryonic. But there is a sort of xenophobia element in there as well, I think. If something goes wrong, it's never the Brits' fault. And I think that's because it's a coping mechanism. You know, you don't want to blame yourself. You want to blame somebody else so that you can kind of reconcile yourself with what's happening and move on psychologically. But there is a tendency to use if there's a foreign contingent, they become the scapegoat for everything going wrong. You see it particularly with the Spanish army, although there are obviously issues with the quality of the Spanish troops and the way in which they were supplied, which influenced that. You see it to a lesser degree with the Portuguese, and I think that depended on whether or not people had bad experiences alongside Portuguese troops. But those who saw the Portuguese fight would generally have acknowledged that they only broke when British troops would have broken up. Wellington definitely wanted Portuguese troops. There were plans to ship Portuguese units out.
Which I just love, really. It's just...
It would have taken them so long to get there that it was never really feasible. But again, that says something. But Wellington handled the Dutch Belgians when he was splitting up different troops across corps, and notably refused to have a British corps and a Dutch Belgian corps, which I think the way that historians tend to argue it is a lack of trust. I think there's also... I think it works both ways, because in having a rigid backbone in the form of British troops that Wellington thought were more likely to stand, you know, if the Dutch Belgian contingent did fall apart, or if there was a mass mutiny and sort of a desertion towards the French army when Napoleon moved in, it at least meant that there was something there to try and hold some troops back, or if that happened in a battle, there were some troops on the spot.
So I think it's a really savvy move of Wellington to do that. It would have been too easy to have had a Dutch-Belgian contingent probably under the Prince of Orange as his first corps, and then a British one, and then and other allied nations as well. And it actually to split them up took a lot more administration and paperwork beforehand for these units that hadn't worked together, but ended up spreading the strength and the weaknesses to give him quite a solid force throughout.
Because we should also, I also think now and again that if you look at Wellington, the way Wellington did things in Portugal and Spain, and then you compare it to Waterloo, he's not acting the same way. As I've said this to you before, Marcus, and you've said to me, he's not really out to win this war by himself. He's quite happy, to be honest, whatever he says later in life. He's quite happy to be a senior member of the Allied army. He's waiting for all of the Allies to line up before he invades France, and that's the point here. They were supposed to invade France. They weren't supposed to be invaded. Otherwise, I'm sure he would have been more concentrated towards the frontier.
I think it's one of our messages, isn't it, Josh? And I sent it to Zach yesterday for his podcast. It's an allied effort. These aren't armies that just happen to find themselves in the same sphere of warfare, which is what I'm afraid that there's some Napoleon files or Napoleon fans that seem to say that, oh, well, Wellington only won because Blucher came to save him. No, and yes, at the same time, the Prussians had a huge contribution, but Wellington knew that was going to happen, or at least hoped and prayed for it. And so it was there.
But equally, you see that from Brits who want to sort of oversimplify this and turn it into sort of some part of nationalistic myth, don't they? And I sometimes see people on Facebook who sort of want to turn it into some kind of football match. We played the French away in Belgium, and then they had a strong offence, but we beat them 3-2 in the end. And you just sort of think, no. Not only was it like a modern football team in the fact that it was transnational, but the football analogy is just stupid and pointless anyway.
It is.
Yeah. But yeah, politically, to keep the Dutch units apart required a bit of a diplomatic fight from Wellington, and there's a trend there between what he did in the Peninsular War, when there was pressure to have an all-Portuguese division, and Wellington point blank refused. So I think you're absolutely right. He's working with a very different system. He's working with very different raw materials, if you like, in terms of the troops that he's got under his command. But he knows what works when it comes to kind of hedging his bets in terms of the quality of the overall corps or the overall division. And I think he plays to that. But as you say, there's a significant militia contingent amongst the Dutch.
And the Hanoverians.
Which must have set him on edge.
Having, foreign militias is really an unknown, and the fear of the unknown is going to be probably quite high.
And consider what happened to the Prussians even before the Waterloo campaign began, where they had massive issues within their army in terms of discipline of troops that have been recruited from nations, particularly Saxony.
Yeah, I was going to say
where they didn't have that loyalty to the Prussian army, and there were big issues with whole units having to be disarmed. And about half of Blucher's army was Landwehr, which is kind of a slightly improved version of militia. In fact, I was looking a few days ago at the makeup of Thielmann's corps, which, for those who don't perhaps know the story in full, was the corps that was left behind at Wavre to hold off Grouchy and kind of cover the Prussian rear as the Prussian army moved to aid Wellington at Waterloo. And about 2/3 of it was Landwehr. Really quite a weak unit, probably the weakest of the corps that Blucher had under him. And it's quite remarkable, really, that they managed to hold off the whole of Grouchy's division. Well, in fact, it was more than a division, wasn't it? It was more like a corps and a half.
Wing, yeah.
For so long.
Mm-hmm. It was a very excellent position at Wavre, with steep banks along a winding river. Well. Yeah, built-up areas, bridges, and Thielmann deployed his troops excellently to take advantage of that. The Prussian infantry and cavalry and artillery were obviously highly professional by this point. One of the most professionally managed, we'll call it, in Europe, thanks to the reforms, which the gentleman, I've forgotten his name now. But the whole staff system was all put together. They knew exactly how to do things now, and which is why they were able to recover from the Battle of Ligny so well, was because of the excellent staff work, which capitalized on the fact the French did not pursue them actively, and managed to get all of these various contingents of militia, landwehr, and regulars, and just running people to safe distances where they could rally. As you were saying about the Saxons at the beginning there, Zach, it's really dramatic, actually. This is a sizable contingent of troops that they had, and it goes to show as well, we say the word Prussians, but we say the word Prussians a little bit in the way we say British. There was actually more to the Prussian army than just Prussians, because if you look at the names, you'll see names like Silesian Landwehr, Pomeranian Landwehr. So you have things like that, and obviously there would have been Saxon regiments, except they hated the Prussians. Yeah. And they mutinied pretty much, and they almost killed Blucher when they came to his headquarters, and he had to disarm them, and he shot a bunch of them and sent the rest of them home.
Happy middle ground, which I personally think is the truth, and I think both you gentlemen will agree with me, which is it seems to be either no, Wellington won, or Blucher won, or Napoleon lost, and everyone seems to kind of, well, not everyone, that's definitely not true, but there's the happy ground that people do tend to forget, that it was a planned Allied effort, and that middle ground of going, no, Wellington didn't win it, Blucher didn't win it, they won it together with the support of these allies, is the point that I think we should hammer home, basically, one last time. It's an Allied army.
We should call it a European victory.
Should do.
You could, yes.
Although there aren't any Russians there, there aren't any Austrians there, so instantly I've kind of shot down that argument. But,
well, if you expand... There are at least two Spaniards. But no, if you expand the campaign, then you do have a European victory there. And in terms of command and control, speaking of the Prussians again, they have a lot of capable officers. Now, it's funny when we're talking about British xenophobia. The only other xenophobic people, really, because the Dutch Belgians are never really concentrated on enough to see whether they were really xenophobic or not, because they'd been fighting for the French for so long, they probably did. You get this sort of ambivalence with some of their more professional officers, that they sort of just, I am a professional soldier, I will fight for whoever gives me the order if my prince commands. And so the only other truly xenophobic people you get in the Waterloo campaign are the Prussians. A lot of their senior officers just irrationally do not trust the British.
Eisenhower, in particular, seems to come to mind.
Even Bülow and Zieten don't really have a great faith in the British.
Blucher's the one who really trusts Wellington and trusts the British, isn't he? But then, having said that, I was discussing this with Will as we recorded for Waterloo Remembered this morning. The sequence will follow later. That move back from Ligny to concentrate again on Wavre must have been instigated by Gneisenau, because at the moment that the Prussians are pulling out from Ligny, Blucher's nowhere to be seen, because he'd fallen from his horse in that cavalry charge, and it took them, an hour, 2 hours to find him. And those were two crucial hours in how the rest of the campaign unfolded. And for all that Gneisenau, as a chief of staff, must have had in his mindset Liège and the danger of having his communications cut, he didn't fall back on Liège and that supply chain with the German states. He pulled back on Wavre, which then enabled Waterloo to happen. Without that, Wellington couldn't have made a stand in Waterloo. He'd have stuck out like a sore thumb. It'd been as bad as staying at Quatre Bras.
Exactly. He'd have moved probably back behind towards Antwerp, or certainly behind Brussels. And actually, it's a really, really interesting part of the campaign, those 2 hours after Ligny, because just of the great staff work. I'm a big fan of staff work in situations like this. And Gneisenau was the guy in charge. And apparently, it came down to pretty much this. He knew the army had to retreat because its center was broken. And he basically, what staff officers were around him, they had a map, and in the half light, they identified the town of Meillerie, or some, I think that's how you pronounce it, which is some miles back. And that was the first place he said to retreat to, because at that point, they couldn't organize them to go to Liège. Now, by the time they got to Meillerie, it was dark. People were saying it was as bad as Jena, because they were expecting the French to be on them. And they found Blücher, and that is his big contribution, I think, because Gneisenau pulled the men back to that position. But he was an excellent staff officer, and he was a Prussian staff officer, and that meant he had to have authorization to move the troops any further once he knew Blücher was alive. Blücher was alive. He found him in a farmhouse somewhere, being rubbed down with some weird concoction of schnapps and garlic or something like that for his bruises.
Rhubarb, wasn't it?
Yeah, something weird.
He was quite badly bruised and battered.
Yeah. And that's where the famous conversation occurs, where there's an argument pretty much between Gneisenau and Blücher about where to go. That's the point where Gneisenau says, we have to go back to Liège. And Blücher, that's the point where Blücher steps up and says, no, we're not going there. I don't know where we're going because I'm concussed, but we're not going there. That fiend
somewhere
Bonaparte,
over there,
yeah,
maybe.
That fiend Bonaparte is still in the field, and as long as he's there, I will not leave it, sort of thing. And then, so being a good officer, staff officer that he was, he looked at the map again, and he found Wavre, and that was where they went. And there was another argument at Wavre, whether they should still go to Liège, back towards Prussia, and that was witnessed by Sir Henry Hardinge, who has lost his hand at Ligny. This is why we know that Blücher had this weird rubdown, because he came out of the room and apologized for stinking a bit before saying we're going to help Wellington.
Brilliant. I think that brings us kind of concluding the Prussians.
I think so.
Doing a bit here. I don't know if we can kind of start looking at the time to start to wrap it off. I don't know if Zach wants to plug something.
I think so, yeah.
Then
Zach, you have
do your summary then, Josh.
You have a big project called Waterloo Remembered, I believe.
That's right. It's taken a lot of organising, but it's starting to fall into place, and it was brought about by actually just a Facebook post on the Duke of Wellington Regiment's Facebook page, where somebody said we need to do something about Waterloo, and it got me thinking. And so it snowballed. I'll be honest, I wasn't initially planning for it to be as large scale as it is, but from the 5th to the 18th of June, so across 2 solid weeks, using my podcast, The Napoleonicist, which people can get for free. They don't need to pay anything. It's available on Spotify and Apple and Google Podcasts. I'm going to be releasing content every single day across those 14 days. A couple of those podcasts will be pieces from me personally, but we've got 10 interviews with experts from around the world, archaeologists, historians, an author. There's even a bloke called Marcus Cribb who I spoke to. I don't know if you've heard of him.
Not
I
really.
don't really like to dwell on those elements very much. You know.
You don't rate him, no?
Quite good fun.
So there'll be those 10 interviews. They'll be released in the run-up to the start of the Waterloo campaign, and then across the 4 main days of the Waterloo campaign, so from the 15th through to the 18th, I've had people, again, from across the world, record 41 extracts of eyewitness testimony. So it's become this sort of, I don't know if it's ever been done on this scale before, but it's become a huge oral history project of the battle and different people's experiences and different nationalities as well. I was very particular about the fact that I wanted Belgian, Prussian, French, British, German, examples in there. And so those will be released 10 a day, apart from the 18th, where I'll release 11. And crucially, one of the really important things about this is that on the final day, on the 18th of June, we will be holding a memorial service. Will Fletcher has been helping me to kind of put that element together, where we're going to hold the same memorial service that was actually done for the bicentenary that was held on the battlefield. And that's going to be available through a YouTube channel, the Waterloo Association YouTube channel, that will be live streamed, which people can listen into, again, completely for free. And in the middle of that, we're going to hold a 1-minute silence at the point at which Napoleon's batteries opened fire on the Anglo-Dutch position. So it's a huge project. As I say, 10 interviews, 41 readings, massive oral history project, and all completely for free via the Napoleonicist podcast. And I'll also be live tweeting about the campaign as it happened 205 years ago through my Twitter account at Zack White History. So please do have a listen, pass the word on, and let's try and get as many people involved. Because if people can talk about their own experiences about the battle, what the battle means to them, perhaps they visited the battlefield, they might want to share photos from their own battlefield visits, they can use the hashtag Waterloo Remembered, and everybody can kind of get involved in that conversation.
Excellent. Yeah, we'll put a bunch of links down below this video for you. Anybody who wants to subscribe to those channels, follow those channels, get involved with the hashtag, and we'll all look forward to that. And so I suppose with that, we bid the audience adieu. We thank you for watching. We'd love it if you leave a comment if you have any questions, and we'll try to answer them for you. And obviously, do whatever it is that do whatever it takes for you to survive on the internet after you've watched this video. If your conscience compels you to like it and to subscribe to this humble shack of a channel, then then do please do so, and we'll see you next time. I'm going to stop the recording there.